I will not relent until we beat this virus. But I need you, the American people. I need you. I need every American to do their part.
After a year of unimaginable loss, U.S. President Biden says every American will have access to a COVID-19 vaccine in the next 2 months. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In his first primetime address, President Biden acknowledged the deaths of more than 531,000 Americans and announced every American will have a chance to get a vaccine by the end of May. This week, the U.S. administration ordered an additional 100 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to increase vaccine supplies. President Biden also signed into law a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package to help Americans out of work and struggling financially. The U.S. President and Vice President joined members of Congress in the Rose Garden on Friday to celebrate the historic achievement.
This legislation extends unemployment insurance by $300 a week until September. It's going to help 11 million Americans who were days from losing that benefit. This legislation includes the biggest investment in child care since World War II. That's not hyperbole, that's just a fact.
For more now on the American Rescue Plan, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Dallas, Texas is Tara Haelle. She's a science and health journalist. From Monterey, California, Spencer Critchley is a Democratic strategist and the author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. And from Los Angeles, California, Dr. Gary Richwald is a communicable and infectious disease expert and the medical director of Curative California Vaccination Project. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Gary Richwald, let me start with you. President Biden pledged that all Americans will have access to a vaccine by the end of May. The hope is that families and friends will be able to get together face-to-face on July 4th to celebrate American Independence Day. That's what he said in his address to the nation on Thursday night. Let's listen to the president.
By July the 4th, there's a good chance you, your families and friends will be able to get together in your backyard or in your neighborhood and have a cookout or a barbecue and celebrate Independence Day. That doesn't mean large events with lots of people together, but it does mean small groups will be able to get together after this long, hard year.
So, Gary, given the vaccine rollout so far, is this a workable plan? Is it practical?
Well, as you mentioned, as the president said, this is a stellar plan compared to the previous president's non-plan. So that's a good start. But, you know, the problems are the holes in the plan. For those of us who work on the ground with vaccine delivery, critical issues still need to be addressed. In California, we have 2.5 million frontline and blue-collar workers, most of whom are not vaccinated, and most of whom need a vaccine delivery plan that's going to work for them, that's going to be open from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. before they go to work, again between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. What we really need is a vaccine rollout that isn't for retired people, that isn't for people who have control over their schedules, but it's for people who really have no choice. Their work, you know, it may come as a surprise to some of the listeners, but these workers are not being given time off for vaccination. They're not being given paid time off. And for them, it's critical that we have a rollout that works for individuals. We're moving into a new phase, and we need to get this next sector, food and ag workers, frontline workers, really taken care of.
Gary, one other issue, and that is, what about those people who do not want to be vaccinated, especially people in poorer communities?
Well, that's a critical issue. You know, we've been dealing with the enthusiastic, the people that overwhelm the call centers. Right now, you're talking about the ambivalent and the uninterested. How are we going to get to those? I'd say our experience is most frontline workers really want to get vaccinated. But as you said, there's a lot of individuals who just haven't really had time to focus on vaccination. They have so many other priorities. We have to do an incredible education job, and we have to make sure that the lines of communication are open and that people who these communities respect are speaking to them and in many cases for them. And so we have a lot of work to do in that area.
Spencer, President Biden also said that the battle against this virus will need the participation of every single American. Let's watch again.
We need everyone to get vaccinated. We need everyone to keep washing their hands, stay socially distanced, and keep wearing the mask as recommended by the CDC. Because even if we devote every resource we have, beating this virus and getting back to normal depends on national unity. And national unity isn't just how politics and politicians vote in Washington, or what the loudest voices say on cable or online. Unity is what we do together as fellow Americans.
So, Spencer, the president there talks about fellow Americans, but the country is clearly divided. Polls are telling us that up to a third of Americans will not accept this vaccination. That is a political question, isn't it? It's not a health question. How does the president overcome that?
Yes, it absolutely is. And I think Joe Biden actually is doing an excellent job of meeting the communication challenge. A really important part of public health is public health communication. It doesn't do to have all of the vaccines and distribution mechanisms in place if people don't know how to get the vaccine or don't want to get the vaccine. The reason I think President Biden is doing such a good job is he understands this is not really an information problem. It's a values and emotions problem. And this is something that some Democrats, frankly, struggle with because they tend to be stuck in their heads and tend to be overly technocratic and think the information is enough. Biden has always understood, I believe, that it's important to lead from the heart and the soul and sometimes the gut. And that's what he's doing there. I also think it kind of evokes Churchill going into World War II. You don't need to baby people. Consumption and marketing-driven culture has started to infantilize Americans way too much, I think. And Churchill showed that people want the truth, and they will take the truth, even if it's frightening. And Joe Biden made that point very explicitly in his remarks yesterday when he talked about the woman who told him, in answer to the question, what do you want? She said, I just want the truth. So I think, lead with emotions and values, be truthful with people, and it will eventually work, and I think it's already working.
All right, and Spencer, the president is also planning a national tour to promote this relief package that he just signed into law. Will that help? Does he need to get into more conservative states as well?
Yes, and I think it's no secret that he thinks that President Obama was a little bit too humble in selling the rescue package after the 2008 crash, for example, the stimulus program, which was a tremendous success. And Biden's not going to make that mistake again. The communications part of this is just absolutely crucial. The battle here is not for the facts. The problem is that, the truth has become itself a consumer product in our culture, and people get to choose their own truth and live in their own media universes. It's critically important to get out there, connect with people on values and emotions, show people who Biden is as a person, because people trust people before they trust any kind of information, and have Vice President Harris and the First Lady and the Second Gentleman out there. I think it's exactly the right approach.
All right, let's go to Dallas and bring Tara Haelle into this conversation. Tara, great to have you with us. Now, you live in Texas, which is a state where the governor has lifted all mask restrictions. He's also said that all businesses, including restaurants, can open to 100% capacity. What kind of response has there been in the state?
It's right down the middle, and it tends to break down along party lines. When you look at the statistics that are coming out of the polls right now, overwhelmingly Trump supporters, Republicans tend to support the lack of a mask mandate, and Democrats and people who voted for Biden tend to be upset that he removed the mask mandate. One of the things I find most ironic about the removal of the mask mandate is that the ostensible reason for it is to say that we have freedom, right? We have the freedom to choose whether we should have to wear a mask or not. The irony of that is that he's actually taken away freedom from many of us who now don't have the freedom to feel as though we can safely go into a store because that store may or may not require masks. Or they might want to require masks, but their employees are afraid to enforce it because there have been attacks on employees that attempt to enforce it. So by trying to, quote unquote, make us more free, he has actually taken away the freedom of people who believe the science and want to continue wearing masks.
Well, Tara, you know, we already have something like 50,000 cases a day in the country. That's despite the fact that there's been a very successful rollout of the vaccine so far. Scientists are concerned that there could be a spike, which could be coming up with things that are happening like what you've talked about in Texas, restrictions being lifted too fast. There's also spring break coming up, and we know that young people are going to be flocking to gatherings, especially at the beach. They may be bringing the virus back with them to their parents, to their grandparents. Are the people of Texas concerned about that?
Those of us who believe the science and the scientists absolutely are. There's a lot of, I'm in several groups on social media where we've shared information about which places are and are not requiring masks and the places that are opening up. And a lot of us are pretty concerned. We're terrified, actually, some of us, especially given the news that there's the variants and some of those variants travel more quickly than the previously dominant strain that was here. So there's definitely concern. It's just that the concern is one-sided. It's, again, divided very clearly along political lines, which is unfortunate because science should not be political. But the prior administration politicized the pandemic and public health measures in such a way that can't really be undone easily.
Gary, there are now about 100 million Americans who have received at least one dose of the vaccine. And I'm wondering, what's the risk of getting far too ahead of ourselves? What happens next?
So I assume when you mean too far ahead of ourselves, I mean assuming that this pandemic is over.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
That is a big problem. We've been here before. Remember, you know, in COVID time, it seems like years ago, but it was only really 4 or 5 months ago. We were pre-Christmas, things were looking pretty good, and things then got wildly out of control. In the grocery stores, more people died as workers in December and January than in the entire time period before. So we have a lot to be concerned about there. And you know, I think the president's positive attitude that we can do this is very important. This is a very tricky time. We have variants widely appearing across the United States. Some of them could become the predominant form of the virus. And we just have to make sure this is, as you know, that Texas is not the United States. Otherwise, we're going to have an insurmountable problem because this is not an invitation. Having your vaccine, getting your second shot or your first shot, if it's the Janssen vaccine, is not an invitation to just go out and do anything. I feel that way. I just want to go out to a restaurant every night of the week. I want to go to the park. I want to do all kinds of issues. But the fact of the matter is, we really need to take a careful look at where things are going. And, you know, and I'm hoping that the populations, the young people, the workers who have not had, the workers between, you know, under 65 who have not had access, that those individuals will be careful. And so with the optimism has to come some reality. And I think the president did make that clear when he said, if you don't join me, you know, he didn't say what would happen. Well, I can tell you, we're going to end up locked down again. And that's going to be, you know, that's going to be hell all over again. And we want to really avoid that.
Okay, well, joining us now is Adolfo Franco. He's a Republican strategist and attorney, and he joins us from the state of Virginia. Adolfo, great to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be with you again.
And at this point, Adolfo, let's talk about that $1.9 trillion economic relief bill that was signed into law by President Biden to help struggling Americans. It will get checks out to people. It will cut the number of children in poverty. It also gets more vaccines out to people as well. It helps small businesses. But the glaring hole in all of this is that there has been no Republican support. This is what the U.S. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy had to say. Let's listen.
This isn't about the virus. As you know, less than 9% is used to defeat the virus. It doesn't prioritize school openings. Most of the money for schools doesn't even go out till 2023. It pays people more to stay home than go back to work. It includes hundreds of billions in state bailouts, when, as the Wall Street Journal reported just last night, despite the pandemic's crushing toll on the U.S. economy, total state revenues were roughly flat in 2020 from the year before. This isn't a relief bill. It's pretty much a payoff for Pelosi's political allies, and it will be the American people paying the bill.
So, Adolfo, I mean, it's not a perfect piece of legislation, but why absolutely no Republican support, given the circumstances in which the country finds itself right now, with people struggling to make ends meet?
Because it's an irresponsible piece of legislation. The fact is, I'll add a couple of statistics, less than 1% of the bill has anything to do with the actual vaccines themselves. So you have a bill where you have $1 trillion that remain unspent from previously appropriated funds that are still in the pipeline, unexpended, and now we're adding another $2 billion. When you add all this up, this is greater than everything we did during the Great Depression in today's dollars. So therefore, what this is a cynical, and I'll just call it that. That's why you have 0 Republican support and 1 Democrat against it in the House. A cynical effort to put forward an agenda to accomplish a great deal of things that are wholly unrelated to COVID, that we will have to pay a huge price in the future. So it's a grossly irresponsible piece of legislation. And in fact, I disagree. I think the economy is opening up dramatically. And it is improving. And what you're doing by this bill is giving incentives to people not to work. Yeah. Particularly in southern and other states where the cost of living is much lower, it is now better to just collect these benefits than to go back to work. This is counterproductive and will slow the economic recovery in the United States. So it will have a detrimental effect currently, presently, in the short, and certainly in the long term.
But Adolfo, there is widespread recognition that people are struggling, that they do need help. What's the alternative that the Republicans would have been acceptable to Republicans?
A targeted bill. Obviously, Republicans have supported in the past in a bipartisan fashion legislation to help people in need. And there was a lot that I think we could have agreed on this bill, to the tune of $600 to almost $1 trillion of spending that I think we could have had agreements ranging from schools to economic assistance to people. So it isn't this idea that there isn't a need, but there is absolutely no disputing the fact that this is a liberal wish list and a bailout for a number of state pension programs and other things wholly unrelated to COVID. And that is grossly irresponsible, and that is exactly why you don't have one Republican, including very liberal Republicans, such as Susan Collins of Maine, and Mitt Romney, who is a liberal but have been more open to work with the Democrats. And as a consequence of this, you cannot have what Joe Biden called for, which is unity, working with Republicans across the aisle. He is doing the opposite.
Spencer, I'm wondering, in the euphoria of this moment, whether some of this criticism is warranted. There was a report put out by a think tank, a non-profit committee for a responsible federal budget, which pointed out that there is $310 billion in the bill that has nothing to do with the pandemic, and another $500 billion that could be cut without affecting the overall package. And the economist Larry Summers has also warned that a bill of this size could put inflationary pressures on the country as well. I mean, is there a point to all of this?
I think there is reason for concern for any time you're spending anywhere near this much money I only wish that we had a good faith negotiating partner in the Republican Party, but those days have been over, unfortunately. I would say going back to Newt Gingrich at least. It's just obstructionism all the time, unfortunately, with the Republican Party, as we saw with President Obama, where they were against programs that they themselves had proposed or even designed, as in the case of Obamacare, which was so much influenced by the Hoover Institution and Mitt Romney's own plan. And once again, we see, unfortunately, Republican elected officials getting religion about debt only when there's a Democratic president, and they were delighted to spend exactly the same amount of money, pretty much, giving tax breaks to corporations and rich people who didn't need it just a couple of years ago. Now, that said, I think we should be careful to recognize that we can't spend money forever. I think in general terms, this is the right approach, and I'm actually delighted to see for once that poor people and middle-class people and small business owners are the priority, not the people who don't need the help. I am a little nervous, though, that every time we think there's a magical new thing, whether it's the internet or Bitcoin or going back to the tulip craze, we think suddenly we've defeated the laws of economics. So as long as we end up generating the economic growth that pays this back, which is what happened with the stimulus program under Obama, it more than paid for itself despite all the obstructionism from Republicans, as long as we recognize that we have to generate the growth that pays this back, and we don't just live forever on a credit card, then I think it is the right thing to do.
Tara, it's a huge relief bill, this COVID relief bill. Part of it will provide money for childcare. Millions of women we know have lost their jobs because they've had to stay home and look after children during the pandemic. So this part of the bill, how significant is this? I mean, what kind of a lifeline does it give to parents?
It's an incalculable lifeline. I'm a parent myself of 2 children who are still in virtual school right now, and I have many parent friends who have been struggling throughout the pandemic. I know more than one woman and father that had to quit their jobs. Even though they were able to do their jobs remotely, they simply could not balance doing their job remotely and taking care of their children, whether their children were in virtual school or whether their children were in a younger child's childcare. So this has been one of many issues that Republicans have consistently overlooked when they focus on trying to do the trickle-down approach with businesses instead of looking at the actual needs of people on the ground. So it was refreshing to see something that actually considered the needs of people who are marginalized, including, in this case, basically any parent in America.
And what are you hearing from people, people like your neighbors, your friends, your relatives, about this package, the fact that they will be getting checks from the federal government?
Obviously, people are thrilled to get the checks. The actual responses to it, again, they fall along party lines. There's been a lot of misinformation about the bill and disinformation coming from the Republican side, including things such as the statement that only 9% goes toward the actual COVID pandemic that McCarthy mentioned there. That is a gross oversimplification of what's in it, because it's only looking at direct things related to the pandemic and not the things that are still tangential to the pandemic, such as the child care relief that is there because of the pandemic, even if it's not directly fighting, the actual disease or the vaccines. So I think that disinformation campaign from the Republicans has had a big impact. That said, what I've heard from people, although my circles are going to be a little bit biased, obviously, but as anyone's would be, but what I've heard pretty much matches up with what the country is showing, which is approval of the bill in the 60s to 70%.
Right, let me get a quick response from Adolfo there. Adolfo, we just heard that part of what the Republicans are doing is a disinformation campaign.
Well, that's certainly not true. I don't know what an effort, a bridge and a tunnel in Silicon Valley and mismanaged pensions in blue states, that's where the big ticket items are, have nothing to do with the pandemic. If you want to say everything has to do with the pandemic, this is just a simple political exercise that they have a crisis and they're taking advantage to put forward an agenda. As an example, it wasn't in the bill because it was ruled out of order, but what does a $15 minimum wage have to do with the pandemic? Now, you can argue from approximate cause that in the entire country, everything needs to be revamped, but that isn't what we're talking about. There was plenty of agreement. And there were bipartisan efforts in the past on a number of hundreds of millions of dollars of direct aid
Right.
to those in need, and also to address the needs of the pandemic. And you're talking about schools. The majority, the minority leader is absolutely right. Most of the spending doesn't happen for 2 years. In many cases, some of the spending is spread over 10 years. So they're not about immediate needs. But the core problem here, and I disagree with the obstructionism comments, we've had bipartisan bills prior to one party now controlling the Congress. This is the danger when you have one party controlling the executive and the legislative branch, where they're pushed through an agenda. I don't believe that Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins, Senator Sass, or these people are obstructionists. They've worked across the aisle, and people have worked when they needed to. So this is, unfortunately, a liberal wish list. There's no question about this.
All right, Gary, I know you want to say something. Go ahead.
Well, look, this is a cynical approach by the Republican Party. The people mentioned are expressing the most cowardice among elected officials. And I think the liberal Republicans fall, unfortunately, into that category. You know, the Republicans, by not think about it differently. Let's say the Republicans in their opposition had come out and say, you know, the number one thing that the president's saying is true. We all need to get vaccinated. And we need to do it really quickly. No more of this, you know, we really need to help ourselves, help our neighbors, help even the people we don't know. If the Republicans had come out and said those things and said, yes, we have concerns about the amount of money, et cetera, that's one thing. But what they're doing is greasing their way into oblivion here. They're headed for the dustbin of history. Can you remember the people who opposed FDR, who opposed Churchill? The fact of the matter is, this country needs to come together, and people need to get vaccinated immediately. And this kind of dodge by the Republicans, you know, look, did you hear somebody earlier in the program say, well, it's more, you know, you do better accepting $300 a week for unemployment. In the South particularly, that was a great statement. Well, if we had had a raise in the minimum wage, which would essentially affect the Republican South, we would have people going back to work. So, you know, the Republicans are talking out of both sides of their mouth, and they're doing something very un-American. They're not looking at the future.
Okay,
we have to.
All right, I want to get to one final point very quickly with Spencer. Spencer, there are voices that are saying that this was a great address by President Biden. He tried to reassure the country that the federal government has got this under control. He called for unity in the country. But there are people who are saying that, look, shouldn't President Trump have got some credit for this? It was his warp speed plan that brought us these vaccines so quickly.
No, you know, President Trump is directly responsible for the needless deaths of literally hundreds of thousands of Americans. And I will go, Gary, one better. I think that really the Republican Party, if it wants to regain credibility and trust, it needs to start by disavowing the big lie of a stolen election. That was an attack on our democracy, and they then enabled an insurrection against our democracy, and their leaders have yet to say the election was not stolen.
All right. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. A great discussion, but that's all we have time for. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.